Welcome to the Digital Enterprise Society podcast, addressing all aspects of the digital enterprise, inspiring connection without boundaries and creation without limits. Thank you for tuning in. Here are your hosts, Tom Singer and Craig Brown.
Well, hello, and welcome to, or welcome back to, the Digital Enterprise Society podcast. Hey, thank you so much for coming along on the journey of this show that's now, we're about a year old, and we designed it so that it would be a resource for those of you who work in and around PLM. The Digital Enterprise Society is a forum for the exchange of ideas surrounding the tools, processes, and practices used across the product lifecycle. To learn more, visit digitalenterprisesociety.org. My name is Tom Singer, and I have the honor to co-host this show every week with Craig Brown, an industry veteran and former PLM leader at General Motors. Hey, Craig, how are you today?
I'm great, Tom. Good to hear your voice. Anxious to have another podcast with you.
And I'm looking forward to today. I think you've got some really interesting questions for our guests, and that's a good thing, because every single week we try to bring to this podcast really interesting interviews and other ideas that are going to help all of our listeners enhance and grow their companies and their careers. Today is going to be one of those shows. Today we have Stefan Jockusch. He is from Siemens Digital Industries Software, and he's the Vice President of Strategy. He's also a board member on the Digital Enterprise Society board. So Stefan, welcome to the Digital Enterprise Society podcast.
Thanks, Tom. Thanks for having me. Thanks, Craig.
So you were telling me before we got started that you had been with Siemens almost 25 years. There was a little stint for 3 years where the division you were with had been sold off to private equity, but then you came back. Give us a little bit of your background over that time, maybe before that. What led you to where you are today?
Yeah, pretty simple. So I studied physics, and one of my motivations to study physics was that back then I looked around which profession that you can graduate in has the least number of unemployed people, and somebody told me that's true for physicists. That was one of my motivations. I didn't particularly care so much, but went into this and went through, of course, late in my studies, I started writing a lot of software code. I was actually doing artificial neural networks, which are very fashionable today, and I did them back in the early 90s. So I wrote tons and tons of code, and after that I was kind of sick of writing code, and I said I want to do something more business oriented and started applying, and then ultimately Siemens hired me for, my first job was an internal consultancy, technology oriented, and then basically after that worked my way through a couple of different businesses at Siemens, and as you just said, I landed in one eventually that was about logistics, and Siemens decided to sell the biggest part of that business to a private equity firm, and they basically kept me on, asked me to stay on, and so I got to live for a little under 3 years under private equity ownership, and then an old relationship from Siemens gave me a call and asked me, would you be interested to work in this exotic new acquisition that Siemens just did called Unigraphics, which was then called Siemens PLM Software? Would you be interested to join that business? And I said, I've never worked in a pure software business in my life before, so that sounds really intriguing and exciting. And that ultimately brought me into what was then called Siemens PLM Software, and today is called Siemens Digital Industries Software.
Hi, Stefan. It's Craig. That's fascinating. I remember the first time you and I met. It's over a decade ago, and so we both kind of had new assignments. And I was impressed that you were from the mothership, from Siemens proper. Now I can tell by your accent, but maybe some of our listeners aren't sure. Tell me where you're from, and how did you get to the United States?
I'm a mixture. So I was born and raised in Germany, and that's probably the accent. Although after living in the US for 19 years, I like to think I don't have one, and you just bust that bubble here. But grew up in Germany. Now I do have an American mother and a German dad. So passports. So the whole migration to the US was a fairly simple thing to do. And basically with a dual citizenship, I theoretically can live and work in both countries. But I'm now here for 19 years and with no plans to go back to Europe.
Interesting. So your probably then okay with not traveling in this time we have with COVID-19.
Frankly, I used to travel a lot. I would say 60 to 70% of the time, and I almost look forward to being stuck in an airport again.
Oh yeah, well, just think about that as you're putting on your mask and your protective gear. But on to other topics. So you and I were exchanging notes, and I was a board member. You're now a board member of the Digital Enterprise Society. And part of what we talk about is transforming businesses. And you pointed something else interesting about your assignment as VP of Strategy. You also have some of the diversity initiatives inside of your company. Can you explain from your vantage point why these two are so important, that Vice President of Strategy and diversity initiatives do belong together?
Yeah, certainly. So as you know, in Digital Enterprise Society, we really talk a lot. We think about what does it take to help businesses in a transformation, and why is it important? Digitalization really means for many businesses that everything is changing, that they suddenly get attacked by competitors, their business gets disrupted by someone who can do things 10 times faster for a fraction of the cost, and all these things. So digitalization comes with a lot of challenge and with a lot of need to step back and to question the business. And then, of course, being in a one of the businesses that support companies in that transition to digitalization, that's something that we look at as a core challenge. And we truly believe that one of the ingredients you need to succeed in that is just a very diverse workforce. So diversity and equity and inclusion really always has been regarded a strategic job, not just something that you get to look for HR to manage, but really it's something that's part of the strategy of building this position and this workforce. And we don't look at it very specifically. For us, diversity and also an equity inclusion is a diversity in everything, in culture, in backgrounds, in experiences. Of course, in nationality, being a global business where now Asia Pacific is the largest region. So it's many, many things. It's not maybe just a few categories that everybody has in mind when we talk about it, but it's everything. We just believe if you want to be ready for rapid change, for rapid disruption by things happening around you, you're at an advantage if you have a workforce that is like this, that is used to cultural and other differences and can work with them. So at Siemens, we have the diversity, equity, and inclusion function really co-owned between the strategy function and the HR function.
So in listening to you speak, the diversity then is way broader than what sometimes people think of it as a metrics driven, and you're looking at your demographics of your population. You're reminding me of my experiences where I had people on my teams that were from India or from China, and it was always interesting to get their perspective on things that maybe we took for granted over here on the Western side of the planet, because they're not used to growing up with cars, and we grew up with cars, right? So it was just interesting. So diversity is broader than just demographics, right? It's also skill-based, and even maybe bringing software people into a car company. You know, it's pretty common now, but not that long ago, people thought it would just be a car, just a mechanical device.
Yeah, I think when we first met, it was quite not as usual. And I also remember one of our early conversations, probably now going back 10 years or so, when we talked about it's one challenge to, for example, successfully do automotive engineering in a country like India. But at some point, you find out how many of your engineers have actually ever driven a car with anti-blocking system. And now they're sitting there designing it. So that's certainly an example. And that's on one hand, I think is a challenge in terms of enabling that. On the other hand, I think if you want to get ideas how to really cost optimize something, then probably India is a good place to look for completely off the wall and new ideas on how to do that. So completely with you there.
Well, we even had a product at one point we put over there, and of course it's a lower cost or lower price entry market. But it was interesting that there was a fine product in other parts of the world, Korea and so on, and we got it to India, and it had durability problems. And it those of you that have driven or been driven in India, you'll appreciate what I'm saying. But yeah, the road conditions are just really different. So diversity also comes in understanding the environment that you're operating in, and the best way sometimes to learn that environment is to be there or to hire people that are there, right? So it's interesting. So what surprises you as you talk inside your company and places like the Digital Enterprise Society? What do you take away from discussions about diversity? What does it mean to be more diverse?
Yeah, as I said, I personally and many of us really define it very broadly, but you just alluded to these metrics that everybody has in their mind first when it comes to diversity. Gender diversity, of course, is top of mind. And I wouldn't say that we're dismissive, because I don't know how many engineering companies in the world are really happy with their gender diversity. I can tell you at Siemens, we are definitely not where we want to be. So it's still
that's partly the education system, right? I mean, for whatever reasons, a lot of, I'm a little older than you are, but a lot of our generation, if I could say it that way, we were divided by gender based upon whether you went to nursing school, teaching school, engineering school, right? And I think that was just the habit back in that time, right?
Right. Yeah, you're right. Education is where it starts, where it needs to go. But we make no mistake about it. I think all of us established engineering companies, we also have to proactively just do more to get women into leadership positions along the whole career path. So at the end, we can look at also a senior team at the top that's hopefully getting close to 50-50. And clearly, we have work to do there. So that's definitely a discussion that we have as well. And it goes across the board. We have a total of 10 areas or group that we look at in Siemens, where we want to make sure we create a really diverse environment. But as I said, my personal view, it also goes even broader than these very measured and statistically analyzed aspects of diversity. It really goes to the point of having a extremely open and extremely transparent workforce, and consciously also creating not just equality, but really taking it from equality to equity.
So it reminds me of what I've seen as a couple stumbling blocks. So one question I have for you is, well, how do you foster or nurture this? And then the second question I have is, well, what do you do about the intrinsic cultural biases?
Maybe it's not with the second one first. So
okay,
but biases, and then we talk to the nurture is the easy part. The biases is probably the harder part. So we actually have a training that is, I don't think it's officially mandatory, but I know that lots and lots of people take it inside of Siemens. It's called the unconscious bias training. And it really teaches you all the biases that you have, but you didn't know you had.
Yeah.
And it's a really interesting training. It was eye-opening for me when I did it. And again, because you walk into it and you're thinking, I'm so completely biased, and you walk out with a completely rectified view of yourself and your thinking patterns. And so that's definitely, it just illustrates how big that is. And I think,
in these times, the demonstrations that are happening as we speak over the unfortunate events with police forces, I think we could all use some eye-opening, right? What are our biases? They're not, especially the ones you learned early on in your life. They're hard to dismantle. I think they need to dismantle them, frankly.
Yeah, and so your question, what do we do about it? So unfortunately, no pill. There is things like this training that I think can improve your thinking patterns, and we certainly put a big effort into this. And then the other question you asked was about how do we nurture it? What do we actually do? And of course, we have dozens and dozens of initiatives. I mean, one thing that we just created inside of Siemens was with the employee groups for different areas for where women come together, or for the next generation players, or even for the they call it bridge, I think, for the more mature, later in the career generation. They're basically organized and get some funding from the company to create this network and to drive it. And of course, doing just keeping the discussion alive and getting engaged also with the community, with the society around us, where we try to move the needle in terms of how we look at these things, and also how we educate ourselves and also interact with the community.
So I'm impressed by your position, right? I've known you as the strategist for a few years, and when you pointed out that you also had this diversity responsibility, I'm like, that's not short-term focus at all. That, making sure your strategies or a strategic element of your development is diversity. I mean, after all, we've all got customers that are not like us, right? And what better way to make sure we address their needs than to have some of them be our cohorts inside the company. So I am impressed with that. That's extremely insightful. So there aren't many companies that do that. And you're right. I can remember a time when we acquired a Google executive to help improve our HR practices. And one of the things that this gentleman talked about was having the wrong measures, and he attacked some of the diversity measures. And I'm sure he did that with the board's blessing. But the point was, we were all about measuring stuff. We weren't about taking action to make it different, right?
Did you say the gentleman was from Google?
Yeah, believe it or not.
Let's not discuss too much about other businesses, but I didn't know that Google was a poster child of diversity.
I think it might have been, but maybe we shouldn't go there. So what would you like to see improve in this whole area? What would be a sign of improving engagement and diversification, as well as maybe its effect on the success of a company?
Yeah, I think, first of all, there's of course lots of numbers you can run, and I think you and I were both not necessarily blind believers just in statistics and numbers, but of course we would like to see the number of women in mid-management and management position and senior management position constantly increase. That's kind of simple way to measure it. When I talk about the bigger picture of diversity, the more complex one, of course, that's in many places a little harder to measure. I think we really benefit as a business from the fact that we do business in 33 countries just in the digital industry software part. We are also, which just means we hopefully better over time figure out more and more how to really understand cultures and behaviors in those parts of the world that we are active in. And we're also pretty closely connected to Siemens, the corporation. I think Siemens operates in a little over 100 countries with their own presence. So, and we are very much tied together there on what we do and how we engage and how we nurture it. So I think over time, there's certain things we can measure easily on how we get better, and others where we hopefully just see it in terms of what is our mix of a management team globally, for example. I just looked recently at an org chart, a new org chart of one of our very large French competitors, and I think on that whole org chart of the senior management team, I found 2 people who were not French nationality, and I think we're already in Siemens doing a little bit better when it comes to that. So there's certain indicators that we can find.
Well, it is interesting. I one last story from my side. We once I used to have a bit of a workforce in India, and in that culture, there's very much a caste system, and it turned out the most talented engineer on the team over there was in one of the lower castes, right? And so I was first surprised he was there because it wasn't typical. He is a very bright guy. And so I put him in a leadership position on a project, right? I said, I need you to run this thing. And yes, you've got employees. And anyways, the team was really unsuccessful. And it turned out it wasn't him at all. It had to do with the other people on the team that wouldn't accept it. And I reminded him, I said, look, you work for a global company. These are our principles. this is the team makeup, and I expect you to work within that framework. Unfortunately, one of the gentlemen, the most vocal, he ended up leaving the company because he couldn't get his head around the fact that what he viewed as a lower class was in charge of a project that he was on. So I think the diversity thing is a huge challenge, but there's also a huge benefit. You get insights on diverse teams you would never get if you have a lot of like-minded people in the same room, right? And yes, it takes time, so that's probably the downer part of it. But I would recommend to everybody, take the time to form those broader teams. You'll be surprised what you learn, and then that probably will make your company more successful. It'll certainly make a more robust tool line, right?
I find your example is also really, really interesting, because it then shows you how your idealism can clash, and it can clash with also things that are deeply a cultural part of your team. There's a pretty obvious other example that we had actually more than one instance of, is that sometimes, of course, we take a stance also, and we talk about we are also completely agnostic to sexual preference. So we have a pride ERG, and of course, in our world in Siemens, there should not be any difference for whether you're lesbian or gay or whatever your preferences are. Now, sometimes you get reactions from your employee base when somebody says, well, but I do believe this is sin, or my belief, my religion tells me that this is not right, and you can't stand up. And you have this situation where you say, okay, now somebody will be unhappy here, right? And you really have to make these trade-off decisions and say this, we have to take a stance, and let's be aware that now we take a position that is in contrast to someone else's cultural belief. Happens all the time.
Well, and not to go religious on us, but there is a New Testament that describes being open and forgiving, as opposed to an Old Testament that had all these strict rules, and I'll just leave it at that.
Definitely goes beyond my pay grade, at least.
Mine too, but I have time on my hands, given that I'm retired, so I read things like that. In any case, hey, Stefan, it's been wonderful chatting with you. I hope the audience has found this insightful. Keep an eye on diversity, and if you get asked to be a part of, or you see something where you can improve the diversity, I would strongly recommend it. It'll not only help your company, it'll help your own perspective. And in times like these, a broader perspective is probably a really good thing. So, Thom, back to you.
Yeah, thank you very much. And thank you for the insightful conversation. Every study I've ever read says that companies who do well with diversity do better with their bottom line. So I think that that's a great message that you shared, Stefan. Any last words that you'd like to share?
I really need to find that article about the bottom line. I wasn't so aware of that, but it's a great hint. And of course, the only thing I would share is definitely, I would agree to the extent that we also do this because we really think it's the better way of doing business. Again, I don't know that statistically it impacts your bottom line, but I'm really happy to see that.
Yeah, I will try and find that. It was a thing that said that people who had diversity on their boards, and then throughout the company as well, typically are companies that tend to do better. So I'll try and find that. I just read that like 2 months ago, so I'll go back and try and find it in my notes.
Great.
Awesome.
Absolutely great news.
Well, thank you very much for joining us. And I hope everybody who listened, I hope that you will plan to join us next week, because every single week, Craig and I try to bring more thoughts, ideas, and information in and around product lifecycle management. Remember, the Digital Enterprise Society, it is the place for the exchange of ideas around digital manufacturing tools. Check us out at digitalenterprisesociety.org.
You've been listening to the Digital Enterprise Society podcast. Learn more about what you've heard here today at digitalenterprisesociety.org. Join us again next week for more connection without boundaries and creation without limits.